It's early morning here in Los Angeles, so I have the sun coming up right here, and we're in the middle of a very intense heat wave as well. But this is a good time to be doing this up on the roof of my house here. Where to start? These first two presentations were fantastic. I felt Simon really set it up lovely, and Jonathan, your work is beautiful, and the principles you include are really a beautiful example of soft power. I believe the softest of soft power is music, the arts in general, but there's music essential in terms of how it connects us together. I've been coming to India for over 25 years. I've worked with some of the most legendary and luminary artists in India, Zakir Hussain and Bikram Ghosh, Shankar Ghosh, Lakshmi Shankar, just to name a few. Also some in the Bollywood world. When I first went to India, I realized there were so many preconceptions that we have in the West of India. And immediately I wanted to almost gain the secret of it instead of realizing I needed to observe it. In doing so, as a drummer, already by the time I went to India, I had my career was established. I had never really played Indian music. So I was in my early 30s when I went the first time to India, and I realized that anything I started learning of Indian music at that time would have been, I started too late. I needed another lifetime for this. So instead of becoming a student of Indian music, I immersed myself in the feeling and the sensibility of Indian music. Playing with some of the most top musicians, Hindustani classical as well as pop and Bollywood, I realized there was a language in this music that seemed to only be accessed if you learn that language. I'm a self-taught musician, so I never had a teacher kind of give me any boundaries in a sense. I didn't have a legacy or a tradition that I needed to be responsible to over my sense of my own feeling of music. So this has been, at some level, for the most part, I would say it's an absolute benefit for me. But I do miss that sense of having a place to belong. And what India did for me was give me a sense of belonging through understanding, not through knowledge or not through literal experience. It gave me a sense of an essence of a culture that was so fully realized through its food, through its art, through its architecture, through its spirituality, that I just wanted to immerse myself in that feeling. And this is what I realized was lost in the West. Not necessarily a discipline or a tradition or a legacy, but more the essence of our soul, the essence of what moves us. So music to me, collaborating with indie musicians, became something that I wanted to exhibit that perspective in. I didn't want to come to India and say I'm a very good American tabla player or I understand all the tihais. And instead of that, you would hear my accent. So I found my own language of which to communicate with Indian musicians. I do this with musicians around the world. I've performed hours and hours of concerts with some that I've never been able to speak a word with, literally. We don't speak a common language except for music. Yet on stage, we share exactly what we're feeling, and it's completely understood in the moment and then in the form of expression. And this fascinates me about music, about the language of music. I think a lot of these examples that you're going to hear today, physical examples of how soft power can influence the world from India, there's an essence that sometimes I think some Indians don't really recognize. So in doing so, I had started collaborating with many musicians, as I said. I had spent the last 2 months or the first 2 months of this year, from January to March in India, touring and performing, and had met some musicians that I knew understood this concept of influencing through influence, in a sense. So what I bring back to India when I come back and I perform is not, again, to show you what I've done literally by translating this language, but I bring back an example of the influence that this culture has And in, you know, music in the West, a lot of people think that India started with the Beatles coming to India in the 60s. And they then comment on, you know, some sitar in the music and some other aspects of Indian music. A lot of musicians and artists here over the years have used samples of Indian musicians. What happened with the Beatles, though, when they came to India was not so much a literal influence of the music, but more understanding this aspect of culture, that culture needed to be broadened in the West. Our eyes needed to be open. So many traditions in India have this, this idea embedded in it, embedded in the practice. The music that I share is coming much more from a place of wanting to show how that influence can then materialize into something new. It doesn't capitalize on it. It doesn't appropriate the culture. It embraces it so deeply, with such a deep form of respect, that what you hear and what you see then becomes something new. And I think a lot of collaborations from East and West is a mashup of Western style with Eastern style, instead of trying to create something that really starts from nothing and let it grow from there. So I'm going to share a minute of music here from the album that Aparna had just commented on, called Kaleidoscope. This is with singer A.B. Madhav, who's a wonderful Hindustani classical singer in Mumbai. I had recorded these tracks during lockdown more as my own sense of therapy. I needed to make peace with my studio and not being able to perform live. And so I started writing this music that just had a very therapeutic sense on me first. I shared it with A.B. Madhav. He was so moved by it, he started singing on it and sent me then the files of his vocals, and we then created this album. What I want you to pay attention to is, although he's singing in a raga, the music itself is not supporting from the place of a Hindustani classical musician. There's no tampura, there's no tabla. So the essence of the raga then becomes something that isn't a learned aspect of music. It becomes something you just feel immediately. The essence of my music then also has that same sense, where you can't categorize it, you can't call it this type of music or that type, but instead it embeds these concepts in such a way that this is what happens, excuse me, this is what happens when two musicians are really coming together in the essence of music and bringing the legacy of their life and their culture and their own influences and allowing it to just roam free in the sound. So I'm going to play a minute of this. So there's a minute of that. I hope you could hear that. Sorry, I didn't have my my screen on until the end, but I hope you could hear some of that. So as you see, the aspect of the influence of the raga.
Sorry, we didn't hear the music.
You didn't hear?
No.
Let me see one more time. Do you see my screen is sharing?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Let me try one more time here. Can you hear that?
No.
Maybe you should stop sharing your screen and play it.
Just play the audio.
I can play it over my speakers, see if you can. Oh, I'm so sorry that's not able to be heard.
No, we can hear it.
So you were able to hear that?
Yes, yes, Greg.
It was very
Okay. So it's a taste of it. It's what I think is real key here is that when I've performed, when I've had listening sessions and played this music for Indian musicians and an Indian audience, they recognize the aspect of the raga. They recognize there's a sensibility there that's still intact coming from their culture. What happens when I play it for friends of mine and colleagues and sessions here in the West, all they hear is beautiful vocals. They don't have to know what raga that is, that it's meant to be listened to at early morning, that it's these ideas that come from a learned place of understanding the art and the culture. And the response I get is fascinating because it's exactly the same from both cultures. So you have a culture on my side listening to this music without any reference of where it comes from, and they just hear beautiful music. You listen to it with an Indian audience, and the Indian audience will then recognize the aspect of the raga in there and then have their own reference points of how that has now been, if you will, deconstructed in a way, but now the essence comes through. You hear the notes of the raga differently. My point, and I think a way to start wrapping up is, I'll share a story with the wonderful tabla player Bikram Ghosh from Calcutta, who I've worked with for over 25 years. And his father, Pandit Shankar Ghosh, who passed away a few years ago, he was a dear friend of mine, and I became very close with him over the years when I would travel. And I remember I was going through this struggle 20 years ago of thinking, I'm playing with so many Indian musicians, maybe I should really start learning the music and start trying to learn at least some phonetics of this language that I could communicate literally. And at that time I was, well into my 40s, and Shankar Ghosh had mentioned to me, and for those who don't know, Pandit Shankar Ghosh is one of the preeminent tabla players from India on the level of Ustad Ala Raka and the best. He shared with me a beautiful idea saying, never forget where you come from. He knew I started out playing drum set and playing rock and roll drum set and having very deep sense of groove and rhythm from a different sensibility than music in Hindustani classical music. But his words of never forget where you came from have always stayed with me, because there's an aspect I think that each one of us brings, not of our culture and not of our legacy and not of what we've learned and memorized and performed and exhibited, but really of ourselves. We each have a unique individual life, yet you could categorize our influences and our experiences into very small subsets, I think. Pain and joy and happiness and realization and these ideas. So in that aspect, I never felt like I needed to identify myself any longer as this type of musician or that type of musician. And when I came to India, it freed me up so much more because I didn't have this sense of feeling I was lesser than because I didn't understand this language. I could share a dialect of a language that I knew was understood around the world, and then we could speak through that dialect of rhythm and music. And I think that's ultimately the goal of soft power, is not to have a sense of dominance or a sense of an umbrella over an idea of culture, but more of recognizing our own individuality and our own sense of purpose in this life that comes from a legitimacy of just being born. And in that sense, I feel that India has an enormous head start, if you will, in being able to influence through soft power around this world, and understanding there's an essence that comes from this culture that exists nowhere else, as every other culture also has that essence. And it's finding not necessarily a common ground of understanding, but a respect and an understanding of those influences coming from a place of purity and truth and honesty and authenticity, and then exhibited through the influences of different cultures. So with that, I think I could probably start wrapping up here. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I just thank you all for this opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of your presentations, and hope that this fills in a little piece of this puzzle that we're all trying to put together here, of connecting in a world that is demanding understanding and respect more than ever. So thank you so much.